Good morning, everyone. Today we are examining Ezekiel chapter 8. Now, in Ezekiel 8, we have another one of the visions that Ezekiel is going to be shown by God, and it's going to be very different from the first one that we see in chapter 1, in that it is going to illustrate reality. In many different ways, the one in chapter 1 was meant to show forth the power and the authority and uh, the glory of God. But here in chapter 8, God is trying to show Ezekiel what it's like back in Jerusalem. And as a matter of fact, this is going to come to pass in the sixth year. Remember, it was in the fifth year when God comes to Ezekiel in the days of the fifth year of the captivity of Jehoiakim. So we're a year later in the process. And he is sitting before the elders of Judah in captivity. Remember, he's by the river Kibar, so he is not in Jerusalem at this time. But I want you to notice what is said, first of all, about the about the presence that comes before him. He stretched in verses 2, in verse 2, it is the likeness of the appearance of fire from the waist down and from the waist up, the color of amber. And then it says that it took him by a lock of his hair, took him to Jerusalem, and there he saw the glory of the God of Israel there, like the vision that I saw in the plain. That's the reference back to Ezekiel chapter 1. And so this is the same kind of vision as far as the way that God is presented in it. But when you come down to verse 5, the essence of the vision is to show him what is going on in the worship of the people and how the people are acting toward God within the temple. And that's the picture that he's wanting to paint. And so while this is a vision, he is not literally in the temple, he is not literally seeing these things. God is showing him exactly the kinds of things that are going on the temple grounds at that very time. And so it's kind of a two-sided situation. It is a vision, but it is showing events that are actually taking place. And so let's notice the four things that God shows to Ezekiel. The first one is in verse 5. He says, Son of man, lift your eyes now toward the north. So I lifted my eyes toward the north, and there, north of the altar gate, was this image of jealousy in the entrance. The image of jealousy here isn't simply an idol that has been erected in the entrance north of the altar gate. And so instead of walking in to the courtyard of the temple and having people who are focusing their minds on God, one of the first things that you're greeted with is this idolatrous image of jealousy, as God calls it. In other words, this image that isn't supposed to be there, that is sitting there in the entrance. You drop down to verse 10. And in verse 10 he says, So I went in and saw, and there every sort of creeping thing, abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed all around on the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, and in their midst stood Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Here you have a private setting. This is going to be more along the lines of the door of the court, and so this is going to be one of the rooms off the court of the temple. And he sees in, and there are all of these idols and all of these animals and insects and all of these various things that are attached to the wall. They're lining the walls of this room. And you have these 70 elders of Israel who are offering incense to these as though they are gods, as though they are their gods. And so these are seen in the inner parts, and he talks about something that is done in the dark of a room or in the back room, so to speak. This is not out publicly, this is a private setting. You drop down to verse 14. And he says, So he brought me to the door of the north gate. of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz is a Sumerian god of food and of things of that nature, and also considered one of the Phoenician gods as well. And so this is another idolatrous god that you have these women sitting here weeping for or weeping toward in their worship or in their prayers toward Tammuz. And then in verse 16, he says, He brought me to the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. So the fourth one is you have them at the very door of the temple itself, and they have their backs to the temple of God. They're bowing and worshiping the sun. What do all of these things have in common? Well, all of these things are worshiping something other than God. The other thing that they all have in common is they are taking place in the very location where God is supposed to be worshiped. That is supposed to be His place, His sanctuary, His location where He meets with His people. And yet His people are meeting with everybody except Him. They are meeting with all of these false gods and with all of these false ideas and false notions. And they have made places for all of them in the place that is supposed to be reserved for God. Now, if that weren't bad enough, they go on and they forget to worship God. God is not going to accept offering to Him and then everything else. But He is even more not going to accept being forgotten for everything else. And that is exactly what has taken place here. So let's make a little bit of application. When God comes into our services, as it were, when God comes into our assemblies, what does He see? Does He see us focused on Him? Does He see us focused on making sure that we are giving our best to bring glory and honor to God? Or does He see people that are more concerned with bringing glory and honor to themselves? Does He see people that are more interested in worshiping their sports and their extracurricular activities, who are more interested in paying homage to civic societies and things of that nature within the walls of their assemblies than they are to focusing on the God for whom they have come together? God is painting a picture of just how bad it is in Jerusalem. But we need to make sure before we scoff and deride those of that day that we are not falling into the same trap, making our worship revolve around us instead of around Him, making our worship revolve around what we like and what we want and what sounds good to us and what we think and what we feel, instead of who He is and what He wants. Those are some of the things that I found in Ezekiel chapter 8. I hope they have been beneficial to you. We are going to take a 1-week break from our studies because of some traveling that I am having to do, but we will be back to continue our studies with Ezekiel chapter 9 shortly. Until then, have a great day.